Well, it's really lovely to be here in this really beautiful theater, which I don't think I've ever been in before. It's so amazing to look at, and to talk to you a little bit about what we think about when we think about safety. And I had not seen this film before, prepping to watch it, to speak to you about it, and it made me think about how hard it is to talk about whether or not something is safe from a scientific perspective. Right? It's very easy to talk about what's dangerous. It's very easy to determine if something's dangerous, but really hard to talk about whether or not something is safe, because it's sort of like what we say, you can't prove a negative. Right? You can't prove that something isn't going to cause harm. You can prove if something does cause harm. Now, when we think about safety, there are a few things that I think we can all agree are just truly hazardous. Right? No one argues anymore about whether or not smoking is safe or harmful. Right? We all agree. And I say that knowing that actually there are still people who argue that smoking is totally fine. In the year 2000, not so long ago, Governor Mike Pence wrote an editorial that said, "Time for a quick reality check. Despite the hysteria from the political class and the media," and what's not written there is scientists, right? "Smoking doesn't kill. 2/3 of smokers do not die from smoking-related illness, and 9 out of 10 smokers do not contract lung cancer." So, of course, when he gets pushed on this a little bit, he clarifies that there's no causal link medically identifying smoking as causing lung cancer. That's just wrong. So we all, as just general citizens of the world, recognize that there are things that we know cause harm. And in fact, the tobacco industry knew in the 1940s and 50s and 60s that smoking caused harm long before the general public knew. And there were reasons how and why the tobacco industry got away with lying to the public about the harm or safety of their product. And when eventually documents from the tobacco industry were turned over, some of those documents revealed the tactics that they had used for years to lie to the public. And this is one of the most famous. It says, "Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy." So tobacco industry executives in the 1960s knew that they were no longer selling tobacco, they were selling scientific doubt. And in fact, we've seen a proliferation of other industries that have used very similar tactics that the tobacco industry used to sell doubt about the safety or harm related to a whole bunch of different things that we worry about as citizens of the world. There's some great techniques that you could use, if you decide to be evil, to manufacture controversy. And these are the techniques that were used by the tobacco industry. Number one, hire consultants and hire scientists to say that this science stuff is wrong. Make sure those are people who are willing to go not just to talk to reporters, but are also willing to go to court and testify if they're needed. Question every study that shows harm, because every study will have some sort of weakness. Dissect every method that is used, because again, every method has a limitation. Dispute every conclusion. In a scientific paper, the conclusion section is an opinion. So dispute it. Fight regulations, because every day that you can delay makes you money. Delay compensating victims, this is truly cynical, because if they die, you win. Use the media and advertising to your advantage. Suggest that you are also researchers and produce science that competes with the science that's out in the world. And since you can never know everything in science, and in fact, this is our own fault as scientists, we always say, well, there's more to know, so make sure that people focus on what you don't know. Which chemical in which cigarette caused your cancer? We don't know. and label scientific studies. You can actually put words on them that are truly meaningless, but that sound really good, right? Sound science versus junk science. We've seen these tactics now used over and over in numerous fields: the coal industry with black lung, climate change and groups like Exxon, the sugar industry that just this past year we learned had paid scientists to write papers blaming the fats in our diet instead of sugars in our diet, the NFL, who hid data for years about the link between head injuries and CTE, and the chemical industry. And it's this last one that I really want to just give you a few minutes of information about how we think about the chemical industry and what is safe. So I'm just going to warn you, the next picture may bother you. This is a tragedy of thalidomide, a drug that was prescribed to women during pregnancy to help them with morning sickness. It was not well tested. And it ended up giving women who had taken thalidomide, at least during very particular periods of pregnancy, babies that were born with malformations of the long bones. In this case, their arms, often their leg bones. And this was a lesson that taught us that how scientists were testing chemicals and how regulatory agencies were evaluating that evidence was not good enough. In the United States, there was one person working at the FDA that prevented this drug from being administered widely to pregnant women, but not so lucky for women in the UK and in Europe, where tens of thousands of children were born with malformations, and just as many died in the womb. The story of diethylstilbestrol, a synthetic estrogen that was prescribed to women during pregnancy with the mistaken notion that if some estrogen is good for you, then more must be better. Those babies were born looking entirely normal, which is why millions of women in the United States were given diethylstilbestrol. It was originally given to women to prevent miscarriage, and it was prescribed specifically to women who were at risk for miscarriage. And then it started to be given to women for all pregnancies. It was hidden in vitamins. So a lot of women had no idea that they had taken this drug. And it wasn't until their daughters reached puberty and developed a very rare cancer of the vagina that it became clear that what had happened to them in the womb was going to leave a stain on them that would last their lifetime. And in fact, now we can look at their granddaughters and grandsons and see effects on them as well. The accident that happened at Seveso, Italy, where a dioxin plant, it actually wasn't a dioxin plant, it was a chemical plant that was uncontrolled and had an explosion and released dioxin, an accidental side effect of the chemical that was being created there for a real purpose, that contaminated the area around Seveso, and thousands of people, led to the slaughtering of tens of thousands of domestic animals, abortions because women were afraid to give birth after having been exposed to dioxin, a chemical that's referred to as the most hazardous chemical on earth. But here we have a real example where we can follow people and evaluate what happens to you when you've been exposed to chemicals like dioxin, like diethylstilbestrol, like thalidomide, at very particular or vulnerable periods of life, and see that the damage can arise quickly where you see it, or not quickly. Now, every child that is born on Earth is born pre-polluted. That's a very provocative way of saying that we can look in the bodies of pregnant women, we can look in amniotic fluid, we can look at umbilical cord blood and find dozens to hundreds of environmental chemicals. They're there at low levels. Their presence doesn't mean that they're necessarily causing harm, but their presence doesn't necessarily mean that those chemicals are safe. And these chemicals are coming from all kinds of sources that we do not think about in our everyday lives. Food and food packaging, chemicals that are sprayed on crops, chemicals that are sprayed in our homes and in our yards, things that we put on our bodies in terms of personal care products, things that we use in order to keep things looking shiny and new in our houses, upholstery, the things we're sitting on right now. All of these items are leaching low-level chemicals, and those chemicals end up in the bodies, not just of pregnant women and their unborn children, but also all of us. Work in my lab and many of my colleagues' lab are not focusing on the stories of diethylstilbestrol or dioxin after explosions lead to large exposures of vulnerable populations, but rather the low-level exposures that we all encounter from doing things that are perfectly normal. And these items here are showing you the kinds of products that contain one chemical that's been extremely well studied, so well studied most of you have heard about it. The chemical is BPA, or bisphenol A. And you've probably heard about it because you've bought something that says this item is BPA-free. Now you can go buy BPA-free water bottles, BPA-free baby bottles. I once went to the grocery store and saw a watermelon marked BPA-free. And so we can start to think about, what do we know about a chemical like BPA? And why would it lead us to have any concern about exposures that are happening at such minute levels that we don't even realize that they're there? The thing is, like diethylstilbestrol, BPA was investigated in the 1930s because it was known to be an estrogen. And it was considered for pharmaceutical purposes, but abandoned and used when DES was used instead. In the 1950s, a chemist came along and said, hey, this stuff has great properties. It makes epoxy resins, it improves paints, it can be used in the linings of cans, and it can be used to make plastics. Something that we knew was an estrogen started to be used in consumer products and leaches from those consumer products and ends up in our bodies. My lab uses rodents to study the effects of these kinds of chemicals, and we can see visible changes. For example, here in the mouse mammary gland, where on the left side you see what a mammary gland should look like, a wintertime tree, and an animal that's been exposed to exceptionally low doses of BPA in the range of what humans regularly encounter only during early life, develops a mammary gland that looks like a springtime tree. In animals that have genetic susceptibility to cancer, BRCA1 mutants, which many women also have, that increase their risk of developing breast cancer, BRCA1 mutant animals are highly sensitive to BPA exposures. And in fact, some rodents, when exposed to BPA, will develop palpable carcinomas of the mammary gland, which would, in a woman, require a mastectomy to treat. When we look at the literally thousands of studies that have been done on this one chemical, BPA, we can see that in humans there are associations to a lot of different diseases that are increasing in human populations, and in animals we can see these outcomes as noted here. Only recently, with this advent of BPA-free products, have we realized that BPA is itself the tip of the iceberg. All those BPA-free products that we all went out and bought, celebrating that BPA was being removed, have instead been replaced by chemicals with similar structure because they have similar functions. At the top is the structure for BPA, and right below it is the structure for bisphenol S, or BPS. When we first were looking at bisphenol S, the very first studies published in about 2013 showed that bisphenol S, like bisphenol A, is estrogenic. And when that paper was published, a reporter called me up, and he said, Laura, I'm not a chemist, but wouldn't you think something called bisphenol S would act like something called bisphenol A? And I said, Brian, I'm not a chemist, but yes. So my lab has been studying the effects of bisphenol S, which is entirely unstudied. Where we have thousands of studies on BPA, we have about 5 on bisphenol S. And our lab has shown that there are changes to the mammary glands of animals that are exposed during pregnancy. That's shown at the top, where the animals actually appear to be producing less milk and to have less developed mammary glands. And animals that are exposed during early life, much like what we saw with BPA, are overly developed when they reach adulthood. When we look at these animals and try to evaluate what kind of parents they become, The mothers who should be grouping their pups and putting them on the nest, nursing them on the nest, actually are happy to leave their pups scattered, where for this animal that means they'll freeze to death because they need heat from their siblings and from their mom to keep them warm. And they'll also, in some cases, go hungry. When we look at how well these moms parent their babies, we see outcomes in their babies that suggest they're not being fed well, that either the milk is not high enough quality or mom is not spending enough time nursing them. When we look to see other features of maternal behavior, we see that the animals that are exposed to bisphenol S are more likely to eat their own offspring. So I could give you a science talk. I don't think you're here for that. I think you're here to see a movie. But I want you to leave here with the understanding that evidence is building that chemicals in our everyday lives that we have thought of as safe may not actually be safe. That using products, and trust me, I'm gonna sit here and drink my soda and eat my popcorn, and you're seeing what I'm wearing. I live in the same world you do. But these aren't necessarily things that are safe. That doesn't mean that they're killing us, but it doesn't mean that they're safe. And when we look at human populations, when we look at rodents in the lab, when we look at wildlife, we are seeing changes over the last several decades during the period of time when chemical production has increased. We're seeing increases in things like autism and ADHD. We're seeing increases in conditions like asthma and autoimmune diseases. We're seeing increases in some cancers. So we're not all fine, even though our life has perhaps gotten better, and lifespan in many ways is increasing. And this is not some fringe scientific belief that environmental chemicals are affecting health. The World Health Organization and UN Environmental Program has released multiple state of science documents on this topic. The Endocrine Society, which is my professional organization, has released multiple hundreds of pages reviewing thousands of studies showing harm from low-dose chemical exposures. The NIH funds this work. This is not fringe science. And in fact, just this summer, the National Academy of Sciences released its first evaluation of low-dose effects and found significant data linking two classes of chemicals with health effects in exposed rodents and exposed people. It is very easy to dismiss this work. I don't suggest you buy this book, I haven't, but it is an example of how easy it is to dismiss the work that suggests that environmental chemicals might be causing harm. One thing that's been done that I've experienced is that as soon as the scientists start talking about harm, we're labeled activists. And that's like the kiss of death to a scientist. No one wants to take you seriously if you're no longer a scientist. We've been labeled things like chemophobic. Like I just said, I'm gonna sit here and drink my soda and eat my popcorn. I live in a world of chemicals just like you do. I'm not afraid of them. They make one-sided economic arguments. If we ban chemicals, industries will collapse, without thinking about the other side of the economic argument. If these chemicals are contributing to human disease, we're all paying for it in one way or another. They argue that scientists that evaluate hazard and risk are ignorant of or even welcome of terrible outcomes. When I went to talk to the Boston City Council years ago, almost 10 years ago now, about BPA, the person who testified after me working for the chemical industry said that I wanted terrorist attacks, the death of babies, and botulism, right? And I thought, oh, I'm not the best person in the world, but those weren't my things that I thought I was signing up for. We've seen industries ghostwrite government reports here in the US, most recently in the European Union. We've seen them interfere with independent panels, insisting that their own representatives be allowed to sit. And in fact, the EPA has recently changed its rules so that a person like me would never be allowed to serve on a panel on any chemical I've ever written about ever. But if I worked for the chemical industry producing those chemicals, I'd be invited because I'd be considered a stakeholder. And again, challenging the scientists or the organizations that they work for, like IARC, the International Agency for Risk of Chemicals related to cancer, rather than challenging the science. So tonight you're going to see this movie Safe, which I'm going to just read for you. It's been described as the best film of the decade, the most astounding American film of the year. This was in the 1990s. But here's a line on the right-hand side that says, in the 21st century, nobody will be safe. Now, from the perspective of chemical safety, what you're going to see here has absolutely nothing to do with what I just told you. This movie is not about low-level chemical safety and exposures during vulnerable periods. There's really not a lot of science behind what you're going to see. And some of the examples that you're going to see, they're overhyped. This one here shows her driving behind a truck releasing diesel fumes, and she's going to have what looks like an asthma attack. She's going to walk at some point into the dry cleaners and have a seizure, and she's going to have a nosebleed, right? This is not what I'm talking about. That's not to dismiss a condition that is very poorly studied, not well understood, multiple chemical sensitivity condition, which for many years was dismissed as a psychological disorder and is very hard to study, but there is some evidence that people who report having this condition are physiologically different from the general population. They very well may be canaries in the coal mine. The movie really is focused more on this concept. But I don't want you to use the over-the-top examples that are shown in this movie, she's going to walk around with a mask on in the middle of a field, to dismiss all chemical safety concerns. Because the two things really are not related. And the amount of data that's mounting that shows that low-level chemical exposures may have associations with diseases that we're concerned about, it is mounting. So perhaps this isn't a movie to view from the perspective of chemical safety, but rather from thinking about how we move through different worlds, in this case a world of privilege, to a world of fear, and how at different parts of our life we're all going to experience living in various worlds and shifting from one world to another, and how that can make us feel like we're not in control and that we're not safe. I'm just going to show you a picture of the beautiful people who work for me. And then I think without further ado, we're going to watch this great movie, Safe.